Good evening. My name is Samia Byrd, and I'm the Chief Race and Equity Officer for Arlington County. I come to this position by way of being a principal planner in CPHD for 10 years and Deputy County Manager with a portfolio over CPHD, focusing on land use, planning, development, and policy for 3 years. You may wonder how I came to the position of Chief Race and Equity Officer. Considering I am a city planner by education, I've worked in the areas of housing and community and economic development as a government contractor in the nonprofit sector, as well as the private sector as a consultant. The reason I became a planner was to build bridges and bridge the gap for people of color, women, and those who are marginalized, wherever I have been or am privileged to go, to physically make communities and neighborhoods better and improve access to resources to enable people to thrive in all areas of their life and empower and build capacity of people of color to contribute to and shape the places where they live. In thinking about this forum tonight, I was reminded of exactly why the work of a practitioner in planning, housing, and community economic development is advancing racial equity. If in fact we acknowledge and understand the history and legacy of systemic racism and how our communities have been developed, built, and maintained. We know the history well, documented in our Missing Middle Housing Study bulletins. But let's consider housing in Arlington today. According to our Race and Ethnicity Dashboard, residential segregation persists, with different racial ethnic groups concentrated in different neighborhoods. In Arlington, 79% of all land zoned for residential development allows single-family detached housing as a matter of right. A map from the Missing Middle Housing Study shows that areas of Arlington zoned primarily for single-family detached housing typically overlap with census tracts where at least 70% of the population is white. Black, Hispanic, or Latino and people of color are much more likely than white residents to rent. In Arlington, overall, 43% of residents own versus 57% who rent. White, 48% own versus 52% who rent. Black, 19% own versus 81% who rent. People of color, including those of two or more or mixed race, 29% own versus 71% who rent. Hispanic or Latino, 31% own versus 69% who rent. Asian, 35% own versus 65% who rent. Renters are more likely to live in multifamily as opposed to single-family homes, and thus, Black, Hispanic, or Latino people of color are disproportionately concentrated in development corridors and other neighborhoods with a higher proportion of this housing type. Will our focus on missing middle housing respond to our housing needs in a way that makes it attainable to those who have been denied access for more than a century through legislation, policy, and practice because of their race? Efforts to create and maintain homogeneous communities by race through redlining, blockbusting, blacklisting, racialized zoning, exclusionary zoning, spot zoning, restrictive covenants and deeds, mortgage lending and financing. I don't know. And definitely not if it is the only thing we are considering or looking to. But what I do know and encourage is that we raise our collective conscious awareness to our unconscious bias of people based on race and class. That we are mindful to discuss and consider not just the what, the when, the where of missing middle, not only the why and how, but the who, the structures and types, the layout, the location, economics are all rooted in the history of people, people's beliefs about who should live where and in what type of housing, what types and neighborhoods, and even who and who should not be neighbors. Centering Black, Indigenous, and people of color in the discussion and framing from the onset as most impacted may for just once in our history and not as the problem or reason why white people can't have nice, safe neighborhoods, but those who, if included or are allowed to enter into those spaces, own homes and have access to those things just the same, would increase economic wealth and health of our communities and enrich and improve the values of our collective neighborhoods communities, and lives. We are talking about building communities, not just types of housing, but communities. We have to lead with an equity mindset, with the goal of closing the gaps so race does not predict one's success in any area of life, which includes housing, and with the goal of improving outcomes for everyone. Think about these 5 questions. Who benefits? Who is burdened? Who is missing? How do we know? And what do we do? This is our equity lens, and notice it centers people who are most impacted first in each of those questions. And I will go further and challenge us before even asking that very first question in our work. We ask, what are our underlying assumptions, individually and collectively, and particularly about people and missing middle housing in Arlington? Remember, the vision for realizing Arlington's commitment to equity, race, is that Arlington will be a place where all are valued, educated, healthy, and safe, regardless of race. And our mission, advance racial equity, is a countywide priority to eliminate, reduce, and prevent disparities in our policies, procedures, practices, engagement, and interaction with and service to the community. How? 1, normalize conversations on race. 2, organize. 3, operationalize. And 4, assess. So why not start with a forum like this? As we enter the conversation tonight about the 5 mistakes localities are making around missing middle housing, be certain to be equity-minded and discuss the equity lens and center it around our underlying assumptions of people and the underlying fact that where we are starting is not a clean slate when considering the history and role race has played in the design, build, rules, and regulations around land use, zoning, housing policies, and practices. The legacy we have been handed is not fair or equitable because it's based on systems that have deep and pervasive roots, designed to create differences and separate us based on race and class, and that we have simply tweaked or tried to add changes or improvements to in the most recent decades. Consider it pre-existing conditions, and by adding on to it, we only compound and suppress the system's roots that must be completely dismantled and rethought. Overwhelming thought? Yes. Hard? Absolutely. No single approach, clear answers, but profound interests. Start with people and history and the understanding of how the places we create physically impact people and how people impact and influence space and place. And further, include and involve people who are impacted in both the discussions and the decisions. Let's be mindful that as we talk about a type of housing and racialized outcomes, this is not new. The reason we're talking about housing and what's missing is because more than a century ago and the decades that have followed, we relegated people to a type of housing, either single family or multifamily, by location, based on race, and then class. We should be careful so as not to repeat or build on this pattern of thought in the 21st century. It benefits or suits none of us. Racial equity is not a destination but a journey. As you journey through this discussion tonight, be mindful to not make a mistake that will result in further racial inequities and housing disparities and othering by not centering our discussions on and with all people in a diverse and inclusive way toward housing and housing types where there is choice, belonging, and opportunity to create true community. Thank you.